I logged into an old 401k a few months ago from a job I hadn't worked in 6 years, mostly just to roll it into an account I actually use. Buried in the settings was a beneficiary section I hadn't looked at since the day I opened the account. The name listed there was someone I broke up with in my 20s. Nothing had happened, nobody was hurt, but I sat there for a solid minute doing the math on how long that name had been sitting there, quietly outdated, completely unnoticed, while I spent years feeling responsible about money in every other visible way. I had a budget. I had an emergency fund. I had investments I checked responsibly and rarely, and somewhere underneath all of it sat one small, forgotten form that could have sent a chunk of my savings to a stranger from my past instead of anyone I'd actually choose today. That moment is what got me thinking seriously about the difference between people who are good with money and people who are actually financially stable, because those turn out to be two different skills. Good with money means you budget well, invest sensibly, avoid debt you can't afford. Financially stable means all of that survives contact with the parts of life nobody plans for, the parts this video is actually about. Here's the first rule. And it's the one that started this whole video. Financially stable people have named their people. Not just loosely, in conversation, but on paper, in the actual forms that legally control what happens to their money. Beneficiary designations on a retirement account or a life insurance policy generally control who receives that money. For many accounts, even when a will says something different or nothing was ever updated at all. Nobody sits down and decides to leave money to an ex-partner. It just happens, quietly, the same way mine almost did, because the form gets filled out once during onboarding and then never looked at again for years. Let's run a quick experiment. Think about how many accounts you've opened in your life, jobs, banks, insurance policies, and how many of them asked you to name a beneficiary at some point. Now think about how many times you've gone back and actually checked whether that name still makes sense. For most people, the honest answer is 0, which means there's a real chance a decision made once, years ago, in a rush, during a first week at a job that's long since ended, is still quietly controlling where real money goes today. Checking takes about 5 minutes per account, start to finish, logging in, confirming the name on the form, moving on. There's no lawyer involved, no fee, no complexity. It's the single easiest fix on this entire list, and also the one almost nobody ever gets around to. There's a second layer to this same rule, a little heavier than a form, and it's the one people put off longest. Right now, more than half of American adults have no estate plan at all, no will, no trust, nothing. Among parents of minor children specifically, roughly 2/3 have no will, which means no written guardianship preference exists for their kids. Without one, a court may ultimately have to decide who cares for them, based on state law and the court's own judgment of the child's best interests, rather than anything the parents would have actually chosen themselves. I put off writing a basic will for years, mostly because it forces you to sit with a scenario nobody wants to picture, over paperwork that feels disproportionately heavy for something you hope never gets used. It took about 90 minutes, once I actually sat down and did it. 90 minutes, against the alternative of leaving that decision to a stranger in a courtroom who has never met the people involved. The math on that trade stops feeling close the moment you actually look at it directly. A coworker of mine went through this from the other side, after a parent passed away without any of this in place. Nothing dramatic or contested, just an ordinary estate, with no will specifying who should handle what. It still took the better part of a year, working through a court process nobody in the family had ever navigated before, to sort out something that 90 minutes of paperwork, years earlier, would have made significantly simpler. She wasn't angry at her parent, exactly. She just kept saying how strange it was that something so avoidable had made an already difficult year so much harder than it needed to be. Here's the second rule, and it sounds almost backwards until you sit with it. Financially stable people insure against catastrophe before they optimize for growth. Insurance is boring. Investing is exciting. Boring rarely wins that argument, even though an investment growing steadily every year does nothing to protect you from the one event that can undo years of that growth in a single stretch. Watch what happens when you compare the risk most people actually plan around to the one almost nobody does. Most people think about losing a job or dying unexpectedly. Fewer think about becoming unable to work due to illness or injury, even though at a similar age, that's meaningfully more likely to happen than death is, and roughly a quarter of today's 20-year-olds can expect to be out of work for a year or more due to disability before they reach retirement. Despite that, most private sector workers carry no long-term disability coverage at all, and most people, when asked to guess their own odds, underestimate them by a wide margin. We insure cars for accidents, statistically less likely than this one, and leave the bigger risk sitting completely uncovered, mostly because a car crash is easy to picture and a slow injury or a diagnosis is not. There's a specific myth worth naming here because it's an easy one to believe without ever checking. Whatever disability coverage comes bundled with a job feels like it's probably enough. Coverage amounts, definitions of what actually counts as disabling, waiting periods, and portability all vary significantly by plan though, so I have some coverage through work, and I'm actually covered if something happens, aren't automatically the same sentence. It's a real benefit, worth using. It's rarely the complete answer it gets assumed to be. A friend of mine found this out directly after a cycling accident left her unable to work for 4 months. She had a solid emergency fund and a retirement account she'd contributed to faithfully for years. By every visible measure, someone who'd done things right. What she didn't have was any way to replace her actual paycheck while she physically couldn't do her job, and those 4 months quietly drained a cushion that had taken years to build. She told me afterward that watching the number in her savings account shrink every week, with nothing new arriving to offset it, was more stressful than the injury itself. "I spent years protecting my money from bad investments," she said. "I never once thought about protecting my income from my own body." Here's the third rule, and it's a quieter shift than it sounds. Financially stable people track their net worth, not their income. Income is a snapshot of 1 month. Net worth, everything you own minus everything you owe, is closer to a scoreboard, and it's the only number that actually tells you whether the last year moved you forward or simply moved money through your hands on its way to somewhere else. A rising income sitting next to a flat or falling net worth isn't progress. It's motion dressed up as progress. Picture 2 people who both got a raise this year. One used it to fund the accounts already covered in previous videos on this channel. The match, the debt, the investments, and their net worth climbed to match the raise. The other let the raise quietly absorb into a slightly nicer apartment and a slightly nicer car, the way raises tend to do without anyone deciding it on purpose, and their net worth barely moved at all. Both of them would call this a good year if you only asked about income. Only one of them actually had one. There's a myth attached to this rule too, that net worth is something to start tracking later once there's actually a meaningful amount of it. It's closer to the opposite. A negative net worth from student debt, tracked honestly from day one, gives you an actual number to watch climb towards zero and then past it, which is far more motivating than avoiding the number entirely because it currently looks discouraging. The habit of checking matters more, early on, than the number itself does. I check mine twice a year now, not because the exact number matters day to day, but because the direction does. One check tells you almost nothing on its own. 2 checks, 6 months apart, tell you whether the whole system underneath it, the budget, the automated investing, the debt payoff, is actually doing its job, or just producing the feeling of progress without the substance behind it. Here's the 4th rule, and it hides behind something that looks like the opposite of risk. Financially stable people diversify their income, not just their investments. If you've watched the video on building a first portfolio, you already understand why owning one company's stock is a concentrated bet. The same logic applies to something people rarely think to question: a single employer being the sole source of every dollar that funds everything else in a life. A steady paycheck feels safe. It's actually a bet on one company's continued willingness and ability to keep paying you, and most people never notice they were carrying that bet until the exact week it stops being true. This doesn't mean everyone needs a side business. It means noticing where your actual leverage sits outside of one employer's decisions: a second income stream, professional relationships actively maintained outside your current company, skills described in terms a stranger in a different industry would still recognize. None of that has to generate real income today. It just has to exist as a genuine option, so a single layoff notice doesn't simultaneously threaten your income, your identity, and every financial plan built on top of both. I know someone who spent 11 years at the same company, doing genuinely excellent work, who assumed that track record alone was a form of security. When a round of layoffs eliminated her entire department with 2 weeks' notice, she discovered that 11 years of loyalty to one employer hadn't built a single relationship anywhere else, and her specific skill set had been described on her resume in terms only people at her old company would recognize. It took her 7 months to find comparable work, not because she wasn't good at her job, but because she'd never once treated her own employability as something that needed active maintenance, the same way a portfolio does. Here's the fifth rule, and it's less a rule of its own than the habit that makes the other four actually stick. Financially stable people review once, deliberately, instead of worrying constantly. Once or twice a year, sit down and check all of it in the same sitting: the net worth number, whether the beneficiaries still match reality, whether the insurance still covers what it needs to, whether the income still depends entirely on one source. A birthday works well for this. So does the start of a new year, or any date that already means something and won't quietly get skipped. Everywhere else in your financial life, this question gets to stay closed. You're not meant to be thinking about beneficiary forms on a random Tuesday. You're meant to have checked them once, closed the loop, and gotten back to your actual life until the next scheduled check. Mine happens every year around my birthday now, mostly because it's a date I was never going to forget. The whole thing rarely takes more than an hour once it's already a habit. Pull up the net worth number, confirm the beneficiaries, glance at the insurance, check whether income still depends too heavily on one place. Most years, nothing actually needs to change. That's not a wasted hour. That's the entire point of it. An hour spent confirming nothing's wrong is a completely different experience from a crisis discovering, in the moment, that something quietly was. Here's the part almost nobody says out loud, and it's the actual reason any of this matters. None of these 5 rules are really about money. They're about what happens to your money the moment something outside your control interrupts the plan. An injury, a death, a layoff, a stretch of bad luck nobody could have priced in ahead of time. A portfolio protects you from the market being unpredictable. These rules protect you from life being unpredictable, which is a different kind of risk entirely, and one that most financial advice quietly skips over because it's less exciting to talk about than which fund to buy next. That's what actually separates financially stable people from people who simply had a good few years. A good stretch can happen to anyone with a decent job and no bad luck yet. Stability is what's still standing after the bad luck finally arrives, because somebody, at some point, sat down and priced in the possibility that it might. None of this requires guessing correctly which specific bad thing shows up, either, which is part of why it's so easy to put off indefinitely. Nobody can know in advance whether it'll be an injury, a layoff, or something else entirely. There's no visible cost to skipping any of these rules this year, the same way there was no visible cost last year. The bill only ever arrives on the one day it turns out you needed it, and by then, it's not a bill you can go back and pay retroactively. The strange part is that every one of these 5 rules is boring by design. None of them will ever trend, none of them make for an exciting thumbnail, and none of them feel urgent on a random Tuesday afternoon. That's not a flaw in the advice, it's the entire reason it works. The things that quietly protect you never announce themselves as important until the one day they suddenly are, and by then it's a different kind of conversation entirely. I think about that old beneficiary form a lot. Not because anything went wrong, nothing did. What stayed with me was how close it came to mattering and how many years it sat there completely unnoticed by someone who genuinely thought she was handling her money responsibly. Being financially stable was never about predicting what goes wrong. It was about making sure that whatever does, it isn't the thing that takes everything else down with it. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding money in a way that actually works in real life, not just on a whiteboard. That's exactly what this channel is all about. Every week, I break down personal finance, investing, budgeting, and wealth building into simple, practical lessons anyone can use. If that sounds like something you'd find valuable, consider subscribing. I'd love to have you here, because the next time you're deciding where to put your attention, a better investment, a bigger raise, one more optimization, take 5 minutes first and check who's actually named on the accounts you already have. That part costs nothing, and it's usually the one thing quietly overdue. Everything else on this channel is about building something. This is about making sure it's still standing when you need it most.